Convidamos o Sr. Patrick Michaels para apresentar suas considerações. Sr. Patrick, membro sênior do Instituto Cato e Ph.D. em Climatologia Ecológica pela Universidade de Wisconsin, foi professor de Ciências Ambientais da Universidade da Virginia e climatologista do Estado da Virginia de 1980 a 2007. É autor de vários livros, incluindo Sound and Fury, The Science and Politics of Global Warming, Satanic Gases, Meltdown, the Predictable Distortion of Global Warming by Scientists, Politicians and the Media, publicado pelo Instituto Cato, e Shattered Consensus, The True State of Global Warming.
Obrigado. Bom dia. Most of my images will be in Portuguese, so it'll be easier for you to follow, but most of the Portuguese that I might speak will not be very good. I would like to talk to you about science, about climate and agriculture. And of course, I have to tell you I have a new book, which I would appreciate, of course, that you would buy. It is called Climate of Extremes. And in this book, I talk about many of the things that I will be speaking about scientifically today. But before we do that, I think it's important to discuss the politics of this issue. I think last night your climate ambassador spoke about the situation in the United States with regard to our passing cap and trade. We have this legislation, Temporal e Comercial, cap and trade, was passed by the House of Representatives on June 26th. It reduces emissions by 3% in 2012, all the way to 83 in 2050. It's impossible. We don't know how to do this. However, this is an example of how severe this legislation is. These are the emissions per capita in the United States. This is where they were in 2005. This is what cap and trade would take them to. By 2050, the average American will be allowed the emissions of the average American in 1867. Now, I have to ask the question, how will this be done? And in fact, what is cap and trade? Okay, temporal e comercial. Well, it works like this. You have to eliminate the emissions from a cow or to compensate for them in one way or another. And if your neighbor cannot do this, you can trade your emissions that you have capped with your neighbor for a price. Now, the problem is that the number of credits or the number of cows drops dramatically. Remember, by 83% in 39 years. So the ultimate result of cap and trade is this. Do not forget, we have to eat. There will be substitutes. I will talk about the effects of cows on climate shortly. However, the major effect is methane. Methane emissions. Two major sources of methane emissions are flatulence bovino and agricultura de arroz. We would like to tell you that we know very much about this scientifically, but I want to show you what you are being asked to do something about. And then you will ask the question, why should agriculture, particularly in Brazil, suffer as a result of this? The bottom line is the observed concentration of methane in the atmosphere. In the late 1990s, the IPCC, United Nations, projected methane concentrations in the atmosphere. This is the range they projected. This is what was forecast to be. This is what is. The forecast was wrong. Now, if you want to ask me why, here's the methane from year to year, the change from year to year, where the line is 0, where it goes below, methane concentrations actually dropped in the atmosphere. If you asked every scientist in 1990 if methane would not continue to go up on this straight line like this, they would say yes, it would. So why did it stop going up? The three most important words in life may not be I love you. They may be I don't know. And nor does anyone else know why this has happened. But it did. Here are the emissions of carbon dioxide from the United States. About 6,000 million metric tons per year. You can see they're going down. Why did they go down in 2009? Because of our economic disaster. And in fact, the law says that the emissions will have to be only 3% below 2005 levels in 2012. That won't be impossible at all. We'll just have to continue to have 10% unemployment, and we'll do it just fine. Here are the emissions from Brazil. About 400 here. We're around 6,000 in the United States. This is a relatively small number. Yes, it is going to grow with your economy. Now, let me ask you, what would happen if we reduced our emissions in the United States by 83%, and all the nations of the world that have obligations under the Kyoto Protocol reduce their emissions by 83%? Whoops. If we did nothing, these are the United Nations temperature estimates, the temperature would rise by 2050, 1.58. If all the nations that do Kyoto do the same thing, the rise would be 1.5. It would do nothing, except it would impoverish the engine of capital in the world, and so that everybody would be the poorer. Now let's take it out to the year 2100. Same thing. 2.5995 temperature rise if business as usual. And if all the countries of the world that have obligations under the Kyoto Protocol reduce their emissions 83% by 2050, the temperature rise is 2.73 degrees. We'll see shortly that those rises are overestimates. Bjorn used the United Nations numbers. I have a preference over the United Nations numbers, the real numbers. I prefer real numbers to numbers that are wrong. How? What is the cost of cap and trade, of tampao? It is this. I don't know. Why do I not know? Because no one knows. Bjorn doesn't know. You know why we don't know? We don't know because we don't know how to reduce emissions 83%. You can't put a price on something when you don't know what something is. But I can give an example. About 2 years ago in the United States, gasoline rose to $4 a gallon. That's about 8 rice a gallon. And our consumption dropped by 4%. 4%. How expensive does it have to be to drop 83%? That's why I said, I don't know. Anyway, this legislation has passed the U.S. House of Representatives. It did on June 26th. And this was before our Independence Day, 4th of July. Our congressmen went home for parades, et cetera, and they saw the first angry, what are called town hall meetings. They didn't start over health care. They started over cap and trade. That's why cap and trade is not going to pass the U.S. Senate. It does not have the required 60 votes, and it's not going to in any form that looks like the bill from the House of Representatives. And then it would have to go back to the House of Representatives. The United States is extremely tense right now. Bullets are being fired through congressmen's offices. Very bad things are happening. Putting cap and trade in the mix will raise the tension even further because it is very unpopular. 48% of people in America now believe, as do I, that global warming is real. Thank you, we have gotten that far. And is caused by people. Thank you, we have gotten that far. And is exaggerated by scientists. All three of those things is what the largest group of people believe in the country. At any rate, so it's going to go from Congress to our EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which is under the President of the United States. In order to limit emissions, the EPA must demonstrate that global warming is a net cost to human health and welfare, and that it is substantially caused by human emissions of greenhouse gases. So when the Copenhagen conference started in December, EPA issued what it called an endangerment finding. And it said, the key thing that it said is this: most of the warming since the mid-1950s is a result of changes in carbon dioxide and methane, in human greenhouse gases. 2 years ago, Bjorn and I were here in Sao Paulo. And while we were here in Sao Paulo, research was being published that was beginning to make this questionable. I will tell you that 3 years ago, I believed this statement. I was a reviewer of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2007 report, and I would have said yes, the majority of the warming since the mid-1950s, since 1950, is a result of greenhouse gases. Since then, remarkable things have happened. As Bjorn and I were speaking here, this temperature curve, this is the temperature history from the East Anglia group. This is the ClimateGate group, but it is the one that we use the most. Since 1950, it shows a rise of 0.7 degrees. And as Bjorn and I were speaking, a researcher by the name of Thompson, and the last author on this paper is Philip Jones, who was one of the key figures in ClimateGate, said that the sea surface temperatures were measured too cold from 1940 through 1965. So that means that there's less warming in this record. And when you account for the fact that sea surfaces were measured too cold back here, the observed warming becomes 0.55 degrees. About the time the IPCC report came out, Ross McKittrick and I published a paper in the Journal of Geophysics. We were looking at what we call non-climatic effects on temperature. Let me give you an example. As you know, all weather stations are painted white. Why? Because if they were black, they would absorb more radiation and record too much heat. Answer me this: how important is it in the economic priorities of the country of Chad to make sure that the weather station stays white? Very low. And so what we find is that the poorer a country is, the more artificial warming is in the temperature record. This only applies to land data, doesn't apply to sea surface temperature data, but when we make this adjustment down here, we lose another 0.08 of a degree, and we're down to 0.47 degrees of warming since the mid-20th century. Susan Solomon is a very decorated scientist from the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. She was trying to study why the temperature has not moved very much in the last 12 years. And she had built what we call a climate model. And she said it is because the water vapor in the stratosphere is declining, it's going down. And so when we adjust for the changes in water vapor in the stratosphere that have nothing to do with human greenhouse emissions, we don't know why they're changing, we lose some more warming, another 0.08 of a degree. We're now down to 0.4. Another emission in the atmosphere is soot. Soot is black carbon. It is not a greenhouse gas. Researcher at University of California, Ramanathan, right here, concludes that the effect of soot on warming in this temperature record is 25% of the warming. We're now down to 0.3 remaining, possibly from greenhouse gases. So the statement is wrong. Every one of those factors that I told you is independent of the other. Now, if we turned on talk radio in the United States, somebody would be shouting, "It's the sun, it's the sun." I didn't even bring in the sun because the estimates of the effect of the sun on recent temperatures are very variable. There's a very large spread. But if I took the average value of those estimates, it would drop the warming down to 0.2. That wasn't caused by all these other factors. I do not know really what the sun is doing, and I think the research is very unclear on that. That's why I did not use it. Urgency. 10 years, Al Gore says. Really? Warming 2.6 degrees for the 21st century. We have computer models for warming. These are the United Nations computer models. Each colored line is a computer model. I want you to notice something. The lines are straight. The warming rates, this is the average, that are predicted, are constant. Why? Because the response of temperature to carbon dioxide is a logarithm. It becomes less and less. But we assume that carbon dioxide goes in as an exponent, increasing rate. You add a logarithm and an exponent, and it shouldn't surprise you that it comes out to a straight line. What's more, the straight lines here are different. They're different computer models. So which one is right? I teach weather forecasting. I taught weather forecasting at University of Virginia. We have different computer models every day that say different things. What do we tell a student when the models say different things? Would you like to know? We say, look out the window. And so, we can look out the window of climate, just like we can look out the window of temperature, because we have temperatures. And if we take a look at the window, that's the red line. These are the observed temperatures. If we assume that this is all due to greenhouse warming, which it's not, but if we assume that it is, this is where we are. Now, if our computer models are so bad that they cannot get the basic mathematical form of warming right, in other words, that the warming would be bending up like this or going like that, then we shouldn't even be having this discussion, because we would know so little science that there would be no basis for any policy whatsoever. So let's assume that the straight line projection is correct. At least it makes my profession feel that it's not as stupid as it might be. Why isn't it warming at the rate that's in those projections? One of the reasons has to do with carbon dioxide. This is the rate, the projection of carbon dioxide changes made by the United Nations, IPCC, and the red line is the concentration in the atmosphere. You can see that it's running right at the low end. And you saw earlier methane, the second most important greenhouse gas, and the one thought to be a result of cows, is growing at a rate that is much less than was being projected. It should surprise no one that the temperatures are not warming up as fast as they're supposed to. Now, what are you getting for the carbon dioxide you're putting in? Well, you're getting a greener world. Here, carbon dioxide is plant food. We all know that. Here are the areas of the world where it is becoming greener. This graph is a little confusing. Both vermelho y verde are increases in carbon and vegetation. Whoops, I'm sorry. Here is another representation of the change in greenness in our planet from satellite, published in 2003 in Science magazine. You can see, it's quite remarkable here, several things. First of all, you can see the massive increase in greenness in the tropical rainforest in South America. How many of you knew that? How many of you read in the newspaper that our forest is becoming denser? It is absorbing more carbon dioxide. The red areas are where there's been deforestation. You can see some here. This is from overgrazing in the Sahelian region in Africa. The green here is the southern end of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is contracting, not expanding. It's like Bjorn Lomborg said. We just published the bad news until there's so much bad news published that good news is actually news. United Nations, 2006. This is the scary part. Cows cause more greenhouse warming than cars. That's absurd. This calculation was done assuming not just what comes from the cow, but what comes from what the cow eats, what comes from the production of what the cow eats, what the land would have done if it weren't farmed, and several other factors that are quite irrelevant to the cow. Nobody takes corn and forces it into a cow. It can go elsewhere. And so we finally found out just 2 months ago, Professor Mitloehner from University of California at Davis, that this is just not true, that eating meat and drinking milk does not contribute to global warming. And the United Nations now admit it. Whoops, we're wrong. Yes, we said that the Himalayan glaciers would melt in 2035. Do you know why we said it? The author of the chapter said we did it to scare the politicians. Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the IPCC, says the IPCC does nothing to do with politics and is science only. Those two things can't be correct in the same world. And the same with meat and climate. By the way, on the Himalayan glaciers, the chapter lead author was a very famous climatologist, Martin Perry. He could not have read that chapter and allowed the years 2035 to go on. At any rate, Brazil produces 18% of the world's cows. Very large in terms of other nations on the world. In India, 29%, but those cows have a different life, or at least a different end than yours. If we take the United Nations temperature record, which projects 2.8 degrees of rise in the 20th century, and eliminate every cow from Brazil, and we assume that your cows are responsible for more greenhouse gas per cow than other cows around the world because of changes in land use. We make all these assumptions. The amount of warming that is stopped is 0.14 degrees Celsius. If we assume the more likely temperature rise, based upon the straight line rise that's been observed, and assuming that the mathematical form of our computer models is not incorrect, you have a difference of 1.6 or 1.52 degrees if we eliminate every cow. There's only one problem with that. These cows feed 300 million people. And Bjorn is right. They're not all going to turn into vegetarians just because the United Nations says it's a good idea. No, people vote. And I assure you, if there were a law in the United States that said you must not eat meat, less people would vote for whoever voted for that than are going to vote for people who say you must buy insurance, which was passed by our Senate, our House last week. A little bit on ClimateGate, and then you can be happy because I will be done. Just a couple. I've translated them. I want to show you why ClimateGate happened. That's what a lot of people don't realize. It'll take me about 5 minutes. This is the temperature history. You are now a scientist in 1995, and you have 3 temperature histories to go by. The blue one is from the IPCC. The green one are weather balloons up in the middle of the atmosphere. And the red is the satellite, which begins in 1979. So look when these 3 records are concurrent. You see the blue one is going up, the green one stays constant, and the red one stays constant. They're referenced to different means, which is why they have different average values. But 2 of them show no warming and 1 shows a warming. And then 5 years later, in the next IPCC report, the surface temperature was changed. Watch as I go 5 years forward. Please just look at the blue line here around 1950. You notice that? It dropped. It became colder. I told you earlier on that that's wrong because the sea surface temperatures were estimated to be too cold. That's never been adjusted. That was discussed in ClimateGate, but that's never been adjusted in the record yet. I don't know why. Anyway, in the next 5 years, this record was adjusted 1 more time, so you'll now be a scientist in 2006. It was decided that the weather balloon data from the tropics had too many errors in it. Remember what I told you about poor countries not taking good weather records? Well, while those records are kept in the United Nations surface temperature record, the United States, which manufactured the weather balloon record, threw out the tropical weather balloons. There's less climate change in the tropics than there are in the northern and southern latitudes. So that's going to put a warming in the weather balloon. And it was decided that the satellite orbit was not as stable as we thought. And it was not measuring the temperature at exactly the same time at exactly the same place every day. And when that was corrected for, look what happened. Watch what happens to these records in 5 years. Yes. The blue line is the same data that existed 15 years ago. And look at how much more warming is put in this record. And so a scientist, Warwick Hughes, asked the person who put together this record, Phil Jones from the University of East Anglia, could you please send me the original data? And here is what Jones wrote to him. We have 25 years or so invested in this. Why should I give it to you when your purpose is to try and find something wrong with it? Ladies and gentlemen, people of Brazil, this is why we do science. We do science to find something wrong with what the other guy did. You don't go into science to make friends. You go into science to make enemies. Have you ever been to a faculty meeting? Don't. Well, at any rate, then there is one more of the famous emails from Benjamin Santer to Phil Jones, the head of the CRU. The next time I see Patrick Michaels, I'm going to threaten to beat the you-know-what out of him. I'm very tempted to beat the you-know-what out of him. Now, this has had consequences. It certainly has caused people to wonder what scientists really do all day. And what some of them really do all day is they go on Facebook and they make sites about, I want to beat people up. So you can join this site right after this talk. I'm sure many of you will be pleased to join this site right after this talk. But remember, this is what happens to Brazilian agriculture under cap and trade. And now ask me what I would do instead. I agree with Bjorn, only I'm probably a little bit more radical than Bjorn. And I'm not so sure that we need to tell our governments to invest our tax money when we can invest our money if it's not taken away in taxes. In companies that produce efficient things or produce things more efficiently. I want to show you on my last slide that people are already doing this. Remember Bjorn said people are adapting to sea level rise? They also adapt. They also invest in companies that produce efficient things compared to their competitors. The blue line is Honda Motor, share price for the last, since the early 1990s. The red is Toyota. These people produced the first hybrid cars. Honda had one on the street in 1999. This is Ford, relatively inefficient. I could show you General Motors, except they went bankrupt producing cars that people didn't want to buy, very inefficient vehicles. So you see what happens when you don't take people's money away. They invested in cleaner technologies. So if you want a world that's cleaner, that's less emissive, you don't know exactly what the technology will be. But if you leave the money in if the money is left in your wallet, you will invest it. It will not sit around, and you will get a cleaner, more efficient world more rapidly. Thank you. Obrigado.